Harold's army was comprised almost entirely of infantry. Lacking mobility, he took up a defensive position on the Senlac Hill, atop of a south-sloping plateau, with dense woodland and swamps protecting his flanks and rear. Professional contingents of housecarls formed in the center, though their ranks were fairly depleted after the bloody encounter just 2 weeks ago. The rest of the troops were the highly motivated but poorly trained furred peasant militia, mobilized just days prior from the local shires. In contrast, the invading host was a well-equipped, generally high-trained amalgam of Norman knights, archers and infantry in the center, with Franco-Flemish and Brittonic infantry and cavalry on the flanks. The Duke's army was fairly experienced, well-organized, and eager to fight. In the early hours of the morning, William sent forth his archers, planning to weaken the tight Anglo-Saxon formation. But Harold packed his men in a tight formation, knowing that sticking together and taking a strong defensive stance was their best bet at a victory. The arrow volleys shot uphill and were largely ineffective, directly hitting the shield wall at a flat angle. Most of the arrow fire was absorbed by the Anglo-Saxon shields. Nonetheless, the Duke ordered his infantry to pass through the archers and head up the slope to test Harold's line. He counted on his footmen to provide the main fighting grunt of the battle, but despite their best efforts, they were unable to open gaps in the solid shield wall. William then led his knights up the slope, hoping their shock charge would punch through the embattled enemy infantry. But the shield wall held. By midday, the combined push of heavy infantry and mounted knights failed to break the resolve of the defenders. Norman cavalry struggled to fight against Harold's men, who were swift to cut down the horses with their axes. They were forced to fall back and regroup for another charge, but the Bretons on the left mistook this maneuver for a rout and began to flee. Some in the Anglo-Saxon line broke formation, leaving the solid shield wall to pursue the enemy. Seeing the rout on his left, William ordered the rest of his troops to disengage and withdraw back down the slope. It was reported that the Duke had 2 horses slain under him during the chaotic fighting, fueling a rumor that he was struck down, which added to the confusion. To prevent a complete rout, William removed his helmet and rode through the ranks in full view of his troops, yelling at the men that he is alive. He then commanded a contingent of Norman knights to strike the flank of the pursuing third militia and managed to rally some of the fleeing troops on the left. As the reformed infantry faced about and the knights closed in, the Anglo-Saxons were forced onto a small hillock where they were surrounded and destroyed. Wanting to seize the moment, now that Godwinson's line had thinned out after heavy fighting, William launched a general assault, personally leading the charge. Archers again shot uphill at the shield wall, but just like the last time, their arrows bounced off the tightly packed shields of the defenders. The advancing Norman infantry, followed by the mounted knights, were met with a barrage of spears, axes, and stones before locking weapons with the Anglo-Saxons. Unable to force openings in the shield wall, once again the attack failed, and the Normans retreated back off the ridge. A break in the fighting probably occurred early in the afternoon, as both armies needed rest and food. With losses mounting for the Normans, it seemed that Harold's plan was working. Seeing the futility of the attacks against the solid Anglo-Saxon line, William revised his strategy, this time sending only his knights forward. Looking to recreate the accidental success on the left flank that drew out some of the Anglo-Saxon infantry earlier in the day, the knights were tasked with charging Harold's line at various points and then retreating back to try and lure the defenders into giving chase down the slope. The Normans engaged the defenders in a brief skirmish before pulling back. However, the feigned retreat failed to draw out the enemy, but the brief clash further thinned out the ranks of the formidable housecarls in the shield wall, who were replaced by third units. With archers in support, the knights charged again, now with more conviction, exchanging blows with the Anglo-Saxons for much of the afternoon. Then they broke and retreated in disarray. Some of the defenders left the shield wall in pursuit of the fleeing Normans. It is not known whether Harold wanted to give chase or if it was spontaneous, though it is likely that the king ordered the troops to hold the line, but failed to control some of the men. And this time, the feigned retreat worked. William's knights wheeled about to face the incoming infantry. During the pursuit, the Anglo-Saxons lost cohesion and were now caught in the open without the protection of the shield wall. Spending much of their energy charging down the slope, the footmen stood no chance against the mounted Norman knights and were quickly overrun. Having dismantled part of the shield wall, the rest of William's army struggled up the hill, bearing down on Harold's remaining units. With a renewed fervor on the invading side, the Duke's infantry and cavalry struck the Anglo-Saxon line. Unable to fight effectively against the better-armed Normans and French, the Anglo-Saxon units rapidly crumbled, with their forces breaking apart and being surrounded by the invading parties. It was at this chaotic time that legend has it Harold was tragically shot in the eye, according to some by friendly fire. He was subsequently toppled from his horse and brutally hacked to pieces by several Norman knights. The death of their king was a horrendous morale blow to the Anglo-Saxons, who began to flee the field, chased down by Norman soldiers. And so it was, the historic Battle of Hastings fell to a decisive victory for the invading Norman forces, and a tragic defeat for the Anglo-Saxons, who lost their king, a man who would ultimately become immortalized not only on the Bayeux tapestry, but in history itself. In the following days and weeks, William, Duke of Normandy, and now the Conqueror, marched onwards to London to receive submission and put down all opposition. On Christmas Day 1066, he was crowned the first Norman King of England, bringing the Anglo-Saxon rule to an end. Cultural changes followed in the wake of the battle and the Norman conquest of England. French became the language of the king's court, gradually blending with the Anglo-Saxon tongue to form modern English. William proved an effective ruler and would go on to become one of England's greatest kings, building dozens of castles and fortifications all over the country, consolidating the kingdom against attackers, and ultimately beginning the Plantagenet monarchical dynasty.